Most people in ancient Israel lived in small villages throughout the land, since this was a largely agricultural society, and that's where the fields were. Most crafts for daily use probably would have been made in the household. In larger settlements or cities, crafts could be more specialized. Often a given craft was located within a particular area of a city, and all of those involved in the craft would live and work in that same area. For example, Jeremiah refers to the baker's street in Jeremiah 37:21. Those participating in a particular craft would be part of a generational household that specialized in that craft. In other words, they were hereditary. Many crafts would be practiced at home, usually out of doors. Full-time artisans might work in a workshop. Making pottery, for example, required a lot of space, so it was often done in workshops. Crafts like tanning would cause a lot of unpleasant smells, and so they would be located at the edge of town. There is archaeological evidence to indicate that the temple precincts and the royal palace were sites of various kinds of craft workshops. Now, pottery was an indispensable craft, as the potter's workshop produced vessels used in everyday and ceremonial life, as well as bricks, tiles, spindle whorls, figurines, and loom weights. A potter's workspace would have included a pottery wheel, space for treading, a kiln, a field for storing fuel and vessels, a dump for the rejects, and a water source. Often caves would be used as workshops because of their cooler temperatures, which allowed for slower drying. Tanning is the process for treating animal skins with tannins to prepare leather. Leather was used, for example, as the outermost curtain for the tabernacle. Leather would have been used for shoes and for some kinds of apparel. Liquid containers consisted of leather. Helmets, parts of shields, and other weapons used leather. It is interesting to note that a lot of dolphin leather was actually used in the ancient world. There were many crafts associated with the making and decorating of textiles: spinning, weaving, embroidery, fulling, which means the shrinking, cleaning, and thickening of new cloth to make it attractive, and dyeing. By the way, this craft of fulling was done by what was called a fuller. And so the last name, Fuller, for Fuller Seminary, actually is a name that originates in a particular craft, obviously in English. Most textiles for the common people would have been made of wool, whereas those who were more wealthy could afford clothing of linen. Linen was used by the Israelite priests. There is some mention of the use of cotton. Women especially were involved in spinning and weaving. See, for example, Proverbs 31:13, 19, 22, and 24. And remember, this was actually a very important economic involvement. Copper, gold, silver, and iron were used in the production of ornaments, jewelry, tools, vessels, and weapons. Job 28 describes much of the work connected with metallurgy and precious stones. Copper was the first to be used in the 4th millennium BCE. They call this, of course, the Bronze Age. At that time, copper was mixed with arsenic at first and later with tin to make it stronger, and that is what they call bronze. Working with iron became more common in the first millennium, called the Iron Age, especially in the production of weapons. Many of the temple vessels were made of silver and gold. See, for example, Kings 6 through 7 and Jeremiah 52:19. The wealthy used gold and silver for jewelry and other adornment. For example, 2 small silver amulets with part of the priestly blessing were found in a tomb at Ketephenom outside the walls of Jerusalem. The alphabet was invented around 2000 BCE, probably by Semitic speakers working among Egyptians. Around the first millennium BCE, the Phoenicians began using a 22-letter alphabet, which was adopted by Aramaic and Hebrew speakers around the same time. Early examples are extant from the 10th century BCE. Most of what remains relates to administration and economics. For monumental inscriptions, inscribed stones would have been used. Examples of letters and receipts have been found written with ink on clay sherds. These are called ostraca. Leather or parchment would have been used for high-level documents written with carbon-based ink. Think using some kind of soot. Documents such as contracts or letters would have been rolled and secured with string, and small clay seal impressions used to seal the documents. People of prominence would have had their own stamp seals for use in such documents. Here are some examples of various kinds of writing that have been found from areas in Israel and Judah, as well as surrounding areas. Sometimes there would be what are called monumental inscriptions that were carved in stone. These would have been erected usually by a king to commemorate certain achievements or deeds. Clay sherds written with ink would have been used both as sort of informal copies of letters, or sometimes letters themselves, and sometimes as economic documents. Seals would have been carried upon one's person to authenticate things like contracts or economic transactions. The seals would have been carved in reverse, and then that would come out in the correct order when they were stamped into little clay bulla, as they are called. Papyrus also would have been used, but papyrus may not always have been available since its main source of supply was in Egypt. And you see in this picture as well a scribe's palette with the ink on one end, as well as brushes made from reed that would have been used in order to write on parchment and papyrus. Literacy was probably not widespread in ancient Israel, although theories about this differ. The profession of scribe would have been one craft among many. Whether one was literate would have been largely a matter of practicality, mostly determined by economic need. Now, universal literacy would not have been possible, and the reason for this is the reason that was also true of the Middle Ages. And I call your attention to this quote by Brad Gregory. It was a world of material scarcity, of natural vulnerability. Let's think about that rural agricultural world. This was a world peopled mostly by agricultural laborers. And who would have done the work necessary to produce the food necessary for the population as a whole if they had all been studying instead? You need a lot of steady, reliable agricultural surplus, sustained year after year, in order even to aspire for something like universal education. That's why we don't see it until the 19th century. In many ways, governance in ancient societies was much less formal than it is in our own world, although this may have differed from place to place. The most immediate source of authority would be within the household. Women had a great deal of authority within the household, particularly the wife of the head of the household, usually the grandmother. It is usually assumed that women had no power because they rarely held public power or public office. But it is important to remember that most of life was spent within the household, not outside it. Also to remember is that most men did not have a lot of power either. The oldest man would be the head of the household, but while he might with his wife exercise authority within the household, his main task was probably to represent the home to the outside world. In this way, you can kind of think in a university setting or educational setting of a college president and the provost. The president represents the college or university to the outside world, while the provost directs internal affairs. Both roles are very important. In village life, elders were in charge of maintaining law and order and delivering justice. Judges could include people appointed by the king. They could include Levites, elders, and their job was to settle disputes, keep order, and protect the widow, orphan, and the stranger. In the era before the kings, leadership would have been provided by the heads of clans and tribes, with the occasional unifying leader rising up in a time of crisis. During the monarchy, kings were meant to maintain the socio-political order to guarantee well-being and security. In other words, the king was responsible for providing justice for cases that could not be resolved at the local level, and he was responsible for providing for defense against other nations and peoples. While there was some form of standing army, most combatants in warfare in ancient Israel would have been able-bodied men coming in from their regular jobs to participate in battle. Separation of church and state was a concept unthinkable throughout the ancient world, and pretty much up until the modern period. This does not mean that governments were theocracies, but rather there were various kinds of leadership, including the priestly, that worked in cooperation, each having its own sphere of influence. At times, as with somebody like Samuel, the offices of judge, priest, and prophet would have been combined. Priests and Levites oversaw the functions of the temple and other shrines in the early days of Israel, including functions of sacrifice, prayer, music, and judicial office. Prophets played the role of intermediary between God and the people by speaking God's word to the people. Very often in Israel, they are seen as interacting with kings and other leaders.